ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor to be part of this year's Dubai International Humanitarian Aid and Development Conference, and many thanks for the kind invitation. This year's DIHAD comes at a critical moment. The war in Ukraine has created a humanitarian crisis of shocking proportions and severity, and this happened almost overnight. And this comes on top of humanitarian needs that were already on a steep upward trajectory. At the beginning of this year, even before the invasion of Ukraine, the United Nations had estimated that nearly 274 million people would need assistance and protection in 2022. This figure, which is already a big increase on 2021, will now increase further. While most humanitarian needs are created by conflict, climate risks are also aggravating existing vulnerabilities. Extreme weather events are increasing poverty and feeding underlying drivers of crisis. The IPCC latest report strongly confirms this. And in many countries in crisis, the effects and after effects of the COVID pandemic are still being felt by disrupting healthcare, by reducing access to education, and compounding existing food crisis for the most marginalized and fragile communities. This will require an even bigger effort from existing humanitarian donors. And it will also require a much broader and more consistent sharing of the responsibility for funding humanitarian action. It is not sustainable that the biggest 20 humanitarian donors account for more than 98% of all public humanitarian funding worldwide. This has to change. But it will also require more and stronger partnerships. And this takes me to the theme of this year's DIHAD. Because in a world faced with new crises on a massive scale, even as existing old conflicts continue, inclusive and strong partnerships must be the bedrock of our response. I therefore wish to thank our host, the United Arab Emirates, for putting the focus of DIHAD this year on global partnerships. Partnership is at the heart of how we, as European Union, work in the area of humanitarian assistance. And I'm very happy, therefore, to see Mr. Jagan Chapagay, Secretary General of the IFRC, one of our biggest humanitarian partners, but also the representatives of many of the UN agencies, of non-governmental organizations that we work with. In fact, we, the European Union, we work with over 200 humanitarian partner organizations across the globe, and many are in this room today. Partnership is at the heart of how the humanitarian system functions. In an acute conflict, like the terrible war that has just been unleashed on Ukraine, humanitarians will often be the only international actors on the ground, providing literally life-saving assistance at huge risk of their own safety, and able to do so not least because they work in accordance with the principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. But in many protracted emergencies, and nowadays many crises are becoming more and more protracted, partnership with development actors is crucial. A few weeks ago, I was in Niger, and I will be returning to the Sahel soon. The Sahel is exposed to a perfect storm of risks and threats, conflicts, extremism, climate change, steep population growth. humanitarians cannot hope to tackle these issues on their own. They require joint up action, partnership between humanitarian organizations, development actors, and the affected countries, including, crucially, local organizations. But at the global level and in the European Union, we have for several years now been talking about the humanitarian development peace nexus. And I think I can truthfully say now that we are no longer just talking about nexus. We are doing the nexus, working to help communities strengthen their resilience against climate or conflict-related threats, building food security, giving people the tools to develop their own livelihoods, even in situations of crisis and fragility. To mention a few examples, in Burundi, we are working with the World Food Programme to set up an anticipatory action scheme that can be activated ahead of climatic shocks. In Vietnam, Cambodia, and the Philippines, we are supporting our partners to scale up anticipatory action mechanisms linked to shock-responsive social protection schemes. This sounds very complex, let me translate. Using climate risk information, they help farmers to protect their crops and livelihoods before typhoons, floods, or droughts strike. In Burkina Faso, our development and humanitarian arms are working together hand in hand to build the resilience of the most vulnerable people, ensuring better access to social protection while working to prevent conflict. These are only some of the many examples of how we are rolling out the nexus, with the humanitarian and development branches of the EU working in tandem, but also in close partnership with the United Nations and non-governmental organizations, both national and international. I know that in the EU we are not alone in having built up the experience in doing the nexus. This year's DIHAD offers a chance to take stock of this experience and scale up implementation. Over the next 3 days, you will have the opportunity to look at how partnerships can support the delivery of UN sustainable goals, with particular focus on zero hunger, climate action, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before closing, let me come back to the horrors we see unfolding in Ukraine. In an important meeting of the humanitarian community such as DIHAD, we cannot but note with dismay the terrible toll the civilians are paying in this conflict. The scale of civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure, even after little more than 2 weeks of conflict, is both terrifying and tragic. As we mobilize humanitarian funding and in-kind support for the victims of the war, we should be united and tireless in underlining the absolute obligation of all parties to respect international humanitarian law, to protect civilians, to ensure safe access for humanitarian assistance, to protect medical personnel and facilities. This is the absolute bedrock of our humanity. Excellencies, thank you once more for inviting me to the DIHAD at a challenging time where effective partnerships are more important than ever. I look forward to hearing about the outcomes of your discussions, and I thank you for your attention.